So let me just give you an overview of the kind of argument that I want to make here today in the talk. I put at the bottom of the screen, I should also thank Richard Layard, you just saw as the founder director of CEP. And I should also mention Steve Nicol, who was also a long-standing member of the Centre for Economic Performance. And he actually was one of the people who kind of really emphasized the importance of thinking about productivity and growth, and really emphasized that. And he's been very influential on my thinking. So, the argument is a kind of simple one. We know that today the UK and the world faces a real challenge of maybe unprecedented scale due to the COVID pandemic. And we have to think about the way in which, as hopefully we kind of rebuild ourselves out of that hole, it's a big hole, and we can do that in a way which can get us back to sustainable and equitable growth. And I think one of the things that has been revealed by the pandemic is the existing weaknesses in both politics and the economy of many countries, including our own. So I'm going to make an argument that our framework should be unashamedly about trying to get back to growth, the right kind of growth, which deals with climate change and also tries to deal with the inequalities we have. And I'm going to argue that when we think about growth, the two kind of key things are to do with innovation, the generation of new ideas to the world, and their diffusion around the world and around the economy. And those new ideas are both technological ideas, kind of hard technologies, but also to do with management practices and organization, which are often thought of being the softer side, but I'm going to argue are very important, maybe as equally important as the kind of hard technologies that we often focus on. And in my view, we actually know quite a lot from research, not just at the center, but from all over the world, over what types of things are important for growth and for innovation diffusion. And I think we can use that knowledge to put together a plan, a growth plan, which can deal with the kind of short run, what we need to do in the next 12 months, but also the longer run, about what Britain and other countries in the world need to think about over the kind of next decades in order to kind of take the opportunity as new vaccines roll out to build a more sustainable future. And I think what really needed is an urgency to do this right now and think about what kind of policies we need to do right now. So I'm going to talk for about 30 or 40 minutes and then kind of open it up. So very, very much hope to get your feedback and questions on the things that we're going to go through. So I'll talk about the challenge that we face to begin with. I'm then going to spend a little bit of time defending about why I think an emphasis on growth is important, then talk about understanding it, talk about some of the puzzles in the UK, and then finally end up with what I think are principles of the growth plan that we need. So here's some measures of the challenge that we face. So this is the last 12 months or so. This is what's happened to the GDP and the economy. And you can see that there was this enormous fall of about a quarter of the size of the economy in April last year. And although there was some recovery over the summer, you can see as we went into the the second and then third lockdown now, also a negative impact on GDP. So the most recent numbers I saw from the Bank of England a few days ago suggested maybe the overall loss might be about 10% for 2010 in terms of GDP. Now, why has that happened? Well, we know why that's happened. It's to do with the pandemic and the set of policy responses that we've had to have in relation to dealing with the pandemic. This graph shows you, I'm sure many of you have seen this before, this is deaths per capita per 100,000 in the UK compared to other countries, US, Germany, Italy, France, and Japan. And you can see that although all countries have taken a hit in terms of the health costs of the pandemic, Britain has been particularly hard hit. So you can see that both in the first wave and also in the kind of second wave, the impact on the UK has been particularly tough. And part of this is clearly due to kind of policy reasons with the slowness of going into lockdown, as well as the emergence of the new UK variants last year. But this is ultimately what's behind this. If we look at this in comparable standards, it's in a way it's unsurprising, given that the kind of health hit we had was so great, that if you look at the overall GDP hit, the UK has been one of the hardest hit countries in the OECD. So this suggests Britain of these comparator countries got hit by 11%, maybe it's 10% according to the Bank of England. No matter what it is, the UK clearly is taking one of the biggest economic hits due to the pandemic. So a very kind of serious position. So this is just the last year. Let's see what this looks like if you look a little more historically. So this looks at the size of the economy, gross domestic product, since 1955. So you can see steady growth. Here's the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Now, we thought when this happened, this was, the kind of the largest maybe hit in terms of the economic damage in my lifetime. But the COVID hit as actually being larger than the global financial crisis. So, it actually is more serious and much bigger fall than we experienced during the collapse of Lehman's and the events which went around that. Now, I've looked at GDP. This is one measure of the size of the economy, but it's important to recognize, and this is the theme that I will keep coming back to, that the size of the economy or GDP or however you measure it is not the most important thing for welfare. Increasing the size of the economy, for example, just by having a bigger population or increasing the amount of hours people worked, is not obviously a desirable thing. What really matters, what is desirable, is if we can increase GDP per capita or increase GDP per hour worked. So productivity, at its simplest, is how you can get more outputs for the same amount of inputs. So, if you're just increasing the amount of hours worked, that's an input. And really what matters is how much extra output you can get per hour worked. So the most important input is people, labor hours. A more sophisticated measure also takes into account how many capital inputs get put in. This is sometimes called total factor productivity. But the simplest measure is this labor productivity, like GDP per hour. And that's important because in the long run, wage growth, people's income growth, generally follows productivity growth. So in terms of the way you should think about it is if we can generate more productivity growth, this increases the size of the economic pie, which gives us choices. And, as a society, we can choose how we spend that additional growth of the pie. We could spend it on more public goods like health or education. We could spend it more on leisure activities so we can work less, take more holidays. We could spend it on more consumption. We could spend it more on environmental improvements or redistribution, but it gives us opportunities. It gives us chances. It gives us a choice of what we want to do. Given that, let's look at what's happened to UK labour productivity. So this is since 1979. So this blue line is this measure of labour productivity, how much output we get per hour worked. And this, I put Lehman's, which is the global financial crisis in the second quarter of 2008. And I've superimposed on this the kind of long run trend productivity level of the British economy. So you can see that, in the 30 years prior to the global financial crisis, Britain was actually growing above its long run productivity trend. There's actually, and I'll talk about this, was quite a good period of time for productivity. But what's stunning is what happened after the global financial crisis. So there was a fall of productivity and then a recovery. But then since about 2010, 2011, productivity has been almost flat. So here is COVID right at the end. So you can see that productivity took a hit in COVID, but really the challenge is actually the fact that there's something like a 30% gap between where we would have expected to be based on pre-crisis trends compared to where we actually are today. So this is a huge difference. And I think this is probably the number one economic problem that Britain faces, is why we've had such slow productivity growth over this period of time. And I'm going to give you some ideas later in the lecture about why I think that's happened, and more importantly, I think what we can maybe do about it to improve things. Now, the reason that slow productivity growth matters, as I said, is it influences, I'll show you, pay growth. And I think that one of the main reasons that we have had, not just in Britain, but all over the world, an upsurge of kind of populist anger has been because of slow wage growth, not just slow wage growth at the top of the distribution, but for the median person, the people in the middle of the distribution. So if you have an era of 13 years or so of where the typical person is hardly getting any increase in their real wages, people don't feel they're any better off than their parents. This causes quite rightly a lot of anger, and especially when some of that pain has been felt more on people throughout the income distribution. Okay, so that's the kind of challenge we face, and it's a big and a serious challenge. What I want to talk about first is to deal with some of the objections to this kind of focus on thinking about growth. So there's at least 5 objections. The first objection, is the one that, well, growth is all very well, but we know it's not really workers who benefit from growth. It's the owners of capital who benefit from growth. So it's not really workers, but capitalists who benefit from the kind of economic growth that I've emphasized. Now, that's a completely legitimate concern. So let's have a look at that. So here is the line for labor productivity that I showed you before. So we see this kind of flattening after the global financial crisis. And here is what's happened to kind of average compensation or average kind of workers' wages. So you can see that over this time period as a whole, workers have followed what's happened to productivity. So there's been about a doubling of productivity growth since 1980 and a doubling of workers' compensation since 1980. So in fact, just as basic economics would argue, productivity growth kind of goes hand in hand with faster worker average compensation growth. So another way of saying this is that the share of the economic pie which has been going to workers has more or less stayed the same over this kind of 4-decade period. So it's kind of an important thing, I think, because a lot of people assume that that's not the case, and that that workers' compensation hasn't gone up the same as productivity, but in the UK it has. Now, that's not true of every country. In other countries, that's not true. And for example, if we look at the United States, and this is often where people kind of focus on, as one of the largest countries in the world, this purple line here is what's happened to productivity. And this blue line is what's happened to average compensation, the same lines that I just showed you before, over a longer time period. So you can see in the US, since from the Second World War to the early 1980s, those lines kind of kept up with each other. But over the period I just showed you in the UK, what happened in the US is that workers' compensation growth grew much more slowly than productivity growth. So this is the fall of the share of labor that I and many other people have written a lot about. So in the US, there was clearly a gap opened up. So wages partially followed productivity growth, but it didn't grow as quickly in the US, whereas it did in the UK. It's also important, of course, that the average wage here, average compensation, is different than the median. The median is what the person in the middle of the distribution gets, whereas the kind of average compensation is tilted because there's a lot of people earning, very high amounts of money, and this is a kind of measure of inequality. So if you look at what's sometimes called decoupling, which is the difference between what's happened to typical workers' wages and productivity per hour, or productivity, then you can see in the US, the reason you've got decoupling is partially because of the fall of the labor share and partially because of an increase of inequality. And as I'll show you, although inequality has also increased in Britain, the labor share, as I just shown you, hasn't fallen. Which leads on to the kind of second objection, which is that faster growth means more inequality. So that would be a reason that we wouldn't want to emphasize, growth, because growth inevitably leads to more inequality. Now, if you think about this, it's, a moment's reflection suggests, well, it's probably not likely to be so obvious, because, if you look around the world, some countries like the United States have a lot of inequality and are also, pretty productive. But other countries, like the Nordic countries, like Sweden, like Denmark, are also very productive and have very low inequality. So it's kind of unlikely that there is a strong relationship, that richer countries or faster growth leads to more inequality. And indeed, there's been a lot of increases of inequality in different countries over the last few decades. So in the US, for example, the increase of inequality started in the late 1970s. This wasn't accompanied by faster growth. If anything, growth slowed down since the kind of oil shocks of the mid-1970s. So again, there's no obvious relationship. In fact, if anything, you can argue that high inequality can actually be bad for growth. And the final consideration is that if you think about, if you want to have more redistribution, it's much easier to redistribute when the economic pie is growing fast. If you have stagnant kind of productivity growth that we've witnessed in the last 13 years or so, actually trying to get, if you're trying to redistribute in the context of a kind of static pie, you're having to take a lot away from some people, whereas if the economy is growing, it's often easier to kind of do redistribution. So for all those reasons, I actually think that, there's no reason why faster growth means faster inequality. And if you look at the UK, here's two measures of inequality. The 90-10 ratio is the difference between people in the top 10% and people in the bottom 10%. That's on the kind of dark green line. Here is the share of the top 1%. This is my friend Tom Piketty likes this particular measure, so I put this on as well. And you can see that, although it's true during the kind of, Mrs. Thatcher 1980s, you had both faster growth and more inequality. That wasn't true for, when you hit the 1990s, inequality on this measure has been pretty stable. And even on this measure, it's been pretty stable since the late 1990s. So, although we had, good productivity growth in those 10 or 15 years leading up to the pre-financial crisis, we didn't see big increases of inequality. And indeed, in the kind of 1960s, where we also had pretty fast growth, inequality was pretty stable. So really, in my view, going back to what's happened to mean and median wages in the UK, really the problem, especially after the global financial crisis, is that productivity has stagnated, and mean real wages and mean median wages have also stagnated as well. So there's been an increase of inequality predating the financial crisis, but the real problem has been kind of stagnant productivity pushing down wages almost anywhere you see in the distribution. This is really an awful period for what's happened to wages. This is the one of the longest periods of wage stagnation we've seen actually for hundreds of years. Okay, so I don't think that an emphasis on growth is bad for workers in both those sense. What about the third objection, that growth actually is inevitably bad for the environment? And I think this is an important challenge to take on, because one of the main things that we have to deal with looking forward is to try and tackle climate change. But again, I think there's three considerations I would say why an emphasis on growth is important here. First of all, in order to tackle climate change, we're going to need green, clean innovation. We're not going to be able to tackle climate change purely by regulation or purely by trying to increase taxes. We're actually also going to need technology. So technology and growth and innovation has to be a key part of the way that we tackle climate change. And a second thing, although I've shown you measures of GDP for convenience, a more appropriate measure of growth like net domestic income should include the depletion of natural capital. So there was a very good report released by my former teacher, Partha Dasgupta, who really emphasized that when we think about proper measures of growth, we should be taking into account the way that natural resources and biodiversity are being depleted. So a good measure of growth will take that into account, quite rightly. And finally, if we think about how the political will to actually enact climate change policies, I think during times when times are very tough, people are not going to be focused so much on climate change as they would do if we can get sustainable kind of growth. So if we can get good productivity growth, then I think it's actually going to open more political space to actually make some of the tough decisions we need to make in order to deal with climate change. So for all those reasons, I don't think there's any necessary connection between growth and environmental degradation. In fact, I think that growth can be a way of actually helping us deal with the problems that we face with climate change if we think about growth in the proper way. Fourthly, and of course this is going back to lots of work that Richard Layard has been pioneering on in the last few decades, is the issue about happiness and well-being. So the question is, we may get growth, but that won't make us any happier. Now, this is, of course, a really important point. So material well-being, increases of productivity, doesn't necessarily make us any happier. But I would appeal, it's hard to measure happiness, although we've made improvements in the measurement of it. But I think there is a lot of evidence that in fact improvements of material well-being do actually help us improving our kind of overall sense of well-being as well. I often appeal to my my Aunt Lorraine here, who has told me that although money doesn't buy you happiness, it often makes your misery a lot easier to bear. And I think there's an important grain of truth in that, in the sense that, you know, it really is the case that people who are in greater poverty and poorer tend not to be happier. And if you look across countries, there is a relationship between the degree of kind of material well-being here on the x-axis and the degree of life satisfaction on the y-axis, even in wealthier countries. So you can argue about the strength of this relationship, but there clearly is some type of relationship there. So I do think that although we should take very seriously the importance of other dimensions of well-being, having improvements of people's material well-being through productivity is part of the overall package of things we need to do to improve overall life satisfaction. So, you know, I hope this has, you know, managed to convince at least some of you that I think an emphasis on growth is a good thing to have. But of course, there is a fifth objection. This is going to be the subject of the rest of the lecture, which is, oh, well, that may be very well, but is there anything we can do about it? Maybe there's nothing we can actually do to improve the growth rate. And, you know, the kind of pessimism about growth is in a way the kind of new normal, I think, in a lot of the kind of media discourse that we have around growth. I put, you know, my friend Robert Goulden down here as someone who's actually argued that, you know, we have to just get used to low growth. And indeed, the traditional approach in economics has been a little bit like that. You know, growth has been something which is exogenous. There's nothing we can do to alter. We just have to adapt to it and adapt our policies to whatever the growth rate happens to be. Now, Philippe Aghion, who I also put here, who is my colleague here at LSE and also my frequent co-author, has been the pioneer of modern growth theory. And the difference between traditional economics and modern growth theory is that modern growth theory really emphasizes that institutions and policies can actually change the speed of growth. And I think that, you know, a lot of the work which has been done by Philippe and many other people and many people at the CEP has strongly shown that there are things that can be done. There are ways you can influence markets, institutions, and policies to actually improve the rate of innovation and growth. And, you know, as a kind of a bit of a, exhibit number one in this is actually what's happened to the UK. So it's often not recognized that in the UK, there was a long period of time over something like 100 years where the UK fell behind other countries in terms of its national income per person, in example, as I'll show you in the US, Germany, and France. But for the 30 years leading up to the global financial crisis, Britain actually managed to reverse that decline. And you know, I think that's not that's not unrelated to many of the policies which were kind of introduced under parties of both power in that period. So just to show you that, what this bar chart does is it normalizes income per person as 100 to be the UK. This is 1870, you know, and the height of this bar, this is the US, for example, of 77. So, you know, back in 1870, the US was something like 23% poorer than the UK. France and Germany, they were something like 40% poorer than the UK. Then over the course of the next 100 years or so, these other countries caught up and overtook the UK. So part of that was natural. Britain was the kind of first industrial nation, which gave us some advantages. But not only did these other countries catch up, but they kind of vastly outstripped us. So the US by the late 1970s has a GDP per capita of 43% higher than the UK had, and between 11 and 16% in France and Germany. So, you know, this was the period of long economic decline that the UK had. But over the next 30 years, things changed. So, you know, on the eve of the global financial crisis, Britain had reduced by a quarter the gap it had with the US, and it had completely caught up and overtaken a little bit what had happened in France and Germany. So, you know, though that's a real change which happened at the UK, and if you look at why those changes happened, I think it's reasonable to think that, and there's evidence that these were these went together with a package of policies which changed the way that the economy worked. So broadly speaking, there was a set of pro-competition policies. Britain joined the European Union, helped create the single market under Mrs. Thatcher and Jacques Delors. There was a strengthening of competition policy, particularly when Gordon Brown was Chancellor. There was an opening to foreign investments, reduced government subsidies, reduced attention for national champions, and that openness actually is, I think, one of the important things which created new markets, created more competition, and actually helped Britain grow. There was an increase of flexibility of labour markets. There was a big increase of human capital and skills through greater higher education. There was more independent regulation. The Bank of England was giving regulation. So the set of all these policies, these structural policies, and these policies to actually increase the kind of inputs to productivity, actually paid some dividends over this time period. So I think that a focus on growth shouldn't be confused with just an obsession with GDP. Proper measurement of it should include human and natural capital. We should take a dashboard approach towards thinking about this. So we should certainly think about health and equality. But I think the focus on growth really is an important and very defensible thing to do. Let's think a little bit about what are the kind of drivers of growth and how we should understand growth. So here's the big picture. So you thought 1870 was a long way back. Now I'm going to go back 2,000 years. So here's the number one fact of what's happened for growth in the world. This is Western Europe and the United States. So this is sometimes called the hockey stick kind of picture, because what you can see here is like a kind of hockey stick. This is per capita GDP again, and you can see that since 1800 and today there's been this big increase of our GDP capita, something like 1,200 in 1800 to about 26,000 today. And of course, the history of humanity is that in the past, whenever there was there was times of having good harvests, population would increase, but then things would go back to normal. There would be a lot of starvation. This Malthusian trap was broken around 1800 or the centuries leading up to that, giving us the first industrial revolution and giving us this way of breaking out of these poverty traps that we'd been in before. And if you don't like GDP, look at what's happened to health. So even as early as recently as 1918, 1 in 10 children in England died before they were 5 years old, and today this is less than 1 in 200. So this incredible increase of wealth has led to real improvements of people's health, and in a very basic way. Now, where does this growth come from? Well, there are a lot of sources of growth, but the growth is fundamentally a story of technical change and improvements of efficiency and innovation. It's not about just more people or more capital. So if you decompose the growth of output per hour, in the US, for example, this has been about 2.5% per annum since the Second World War. 2% of that comes from improvements of innovation, from total factor productivity, sometimes called the Solow residual after my former colleague Bob Solow at MIT, and about 0.5% comes from capital and labor. So these are important, but 80% of this improvement has come from technological change. So that is the kind of key important thing when we think about the growth story. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's actually two parts of that. So one is the kind of hard technologies that we think about, but the other is also the way we organize work through management practices, as emphasized by Adam Smith and many other people. So it's probably easy to convince you that technology matters. So if we think about the kind of history of the industrial revolutions, first in England under steam in the late 18th century, then under the incredible second industrial revolution in the late 19th century, we had the innovations of illumination with Edison, of mobility under the internal combustion engine, of communication, of the wireless, as an amazing wave of innovations in the second industrial revolution, through to the third industrial revolution under the kind of Moore's law, if you like, this, the growth of the internet, the growth of digital computers. This is powered by vast improvements in the productivity of the semiconductor chip industry, something like 35% a year. And maybe through to the kind of fourth industrial revolution that we're living through now, with the era of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and huge data sets, of robotics, of gene therapy. So, these innovations are powering the changes that we've seen. But I want to emphasize it's not just about the kind of hard technologies. Management is also, an organization is also an important part of this, whether those are the kind of changes that we saw through Frederick Taylor's scientific management, all the way to Alfred Sloan's new form of organizing companies, through the modern Toyota lean manufacturing system. And really the story here is that you get these kind of major innovations that I've talked about, but in order to make best use of them for productivity, you often need to make a lot of changes to the way that you work. So, for example, if you look at the innovation of electricity, it took many decades before that fed through to productivity, because there was a need to change the way that factories worked, to run through the factory system using lighting, running at a high speed for longer periods of the day. So these management changes were really or sometimes called complementary inputs, which enabled that technology to actually be used effectively. And I think that may also be true when we think about the long time it takes for computers to have shown up in the productivity statistics, and maybe for artificial intelligence too. Another way of thinking of this is that firms can spend huge amounts of money on technology, and this can end up having very little effect on productivity unless unless you actually have good organization and management to use those. So thinking whether it's about technology or about management, there's at least two different sources of this. So one is this new ideas to the world, which is innovation or frontier productivity growth. The second is how those ideas diffuse through the economy, how they spread through the economy. Now, innovation is actually harder than diffusion. So inventing the wheel was pretty hard, but once it was invented, it could diffuse a lot more quickly, because people just had to copy it rather than having to come up with it again for the first time. And I put Guns, Germs, and Steel, those of you know Jared Diamond's book, as an example. Diffusion is not necessarily simple. It has important geographical elements, has issues of information, but certainly it's kind of easier to do than coming up with the ideas in the first place. So if you think about many developing countries, as countries emerge, they can rely a lot on diffusion, on using ideas generated elsewhere. But as countries become rich, like the UK has, catch-up growth becomes much harder, and you have to think about innovating at the frontier. So there's lots of different industries and technologies. You can't just rely on catch-up growth. Now, a really important part of this process is what economists sometimes call reallocation, which is the idea that resources need to get moved between one firm, some types of jobs, and other types of jobs. Innovative firms often displace incumbent firms. It's called creative destruction. The diffusion of new techniques is often done by young firms rather than older incumbents who are slower to adapt to new technologies. So this dynamic process, Schumpeter's creative destruction, is a really important part of growth. It's not just the same firms becoming more productive, it's the reshuffling around of assets and activity amongst different firms. And I'm going to return to this when I talk about what we need for a kind of a growth plan to get out of our current crisis. I'll say a word or two about management practices. As the video at the beginning said, that CP's been pioneering and trying to think about these. So, there was a survey, not too long ago by Chad Syverson at the University of Chicago, who said that no potential driving factor of productivity has seen such a high ratio of speculation and empirical study. And what he meant by that was, people often talk about management being important. Here's this is from the San Francisco airport bookshop, and you can see here lots of books, lots of case studies about Steve Jobs or Amazon or other famous firms. I used to teach at a business school. We love to use case studies to teach, but of course, as we say, one swallow doesn't make a summer. A single case study is an observation of one, and it's highly selected. And this was actually brought home to me very vividly when I started working in this area, and I went to see there was a senior partner in one of the world's top management consultancy firms, talking about his new book, and he was describing this case study of this company he'd done, which was the most amazing company with the best management practices, and it was really innovative, and how other companies should be emulating this great company. And then it emerged as he was talking, he didn't actually mention this company, but this company was this company called Enron. And I'm not sure how many of you are old enough to remember Enron, but Enron was an energy trading company, very highly valued on the stock market, but was found out to have been doing accounting irregularities and basically stealing money off its shareholders. And as this senior consultant was speaking about his book, the CEO of Enron was being taken off in chains by US Marshals and arrested and put it into prison. So in fact, some people are saying you should change the logo from Enron from this to this, as Americans say, flipping the bird, as this is the way that Enron was treating its workers and shareholders. So the bottom line is that single case studies, although they're very good for teaching, are not necessarily good for proving the case. So some of the work which has been done by myself and colleagues at the CEP has been trying to get much better measures of management. And we've done this in many ways. One way is from this thing we call the World Management Survey, which is interviews with managers from all over the world, from everything from manufacturing to hospitals to retail. We've now interviewed about 25,000 managers in 39 countries since we started in 2004. And we've helped build up a database looking at basic things around management, about how you collect data in your firm, how you do goals and target setting, how you incentivize people through the rewards, through hiring and firing and so on. And we found this was this database has been a very useful one to understand about the role of management and productivity. If you look at the average management scores across countries, you see that this is pretty highly correlated with what the productivity levels are. So the UK is not doing too badly, but you can see that we're well below some of the leading countries like the US, Japan, Germany, and Sweden. If you look within every country, you see this enormous variation of managements across different firms. So this is showing the distribution. So although the US, for example, has a high average management score than the UK, there's many very badly managed US firms, and there's many very well managed UK firms. One of the big differences is that in the US there's a lot fewer really badly managed firms than there is in the UK. The UK has a much longer tail of low productivity, badly managed firms, and it suggests that either through improved diffusion or through more reallocation, this should be a way of improving the management and therefore the productivity in the UK. These management scores are highly correlated with productivity, but also with profits, with growth, indeed with innovations, measures like R&D and patenting and exporting activity. And if you try and use this to kind of figure out how much of the UK productivity gap you can account for, it accounts for a reasonable amount. So it accounts for maybe half of all the productivity gap as related to these kind of management practices. So, the bottom line on this is that, technology matters, but so does organization and management. So we need to think about both of those. And actually, for those of students who are in the room, I'll say one good thing about this kind of research, we do the radical econometric methodology called talking to people, which is what not many economists do. And when you talk to people, you find things that you weren't necessarily expecting. So we interviewed this one production manager who said, we asked him, who are you owned by? And he was very honest. He said, we are owned by the mafia. The interviewer started getting very nervous on the other end of the telephone at that point. And he said, I think that's in the other category, although I guess I could put you down as an Italian multinational. So all this data, by the way, can be downloaded from the site I just showed you. So, you're welcome to have a look through that. Having lived in America for quite a while before I came back to the LSE, my daughter was at the government school in America, and I can say that the Americans do well in some dimensions of management and productivity. The teaching of geography needs a little bit to be desired. So one question we asked was, how many production sites do you have abroad? And the manager in Indiana, which is in the US, said, well, we have one in Texas, which some people say Texas is a different country, so maybe that was the right answer. Okay, so let me just circle back to where I started in terms of the UK productivity puzzle. So, there are, given time constraints, I can spend a long time talking about why UK productivity has been so poor since the financial crisis. I don't think there's a silver bullet. The truth is we don't know all the explanations here. The low productivity has been a long-standing problem in the UK. There's probably some degree of mismeasurements. There is a global problem. It's not just in the UK. I showed you in the US there's also been some slowdown of productivity growth, even though it's been faster in the UK. I think the exposure that the UK had to the financial sector has been important. So the hangover of debt, of zombie firms, of the problem of the fact that there's not enough finance to make investments is important. I think policy was also important. We moved too quickly to austerity after the global financial crisis. That also meant that we had very big cuts in public investment and infrastructure, and more recently Brexit uncertainty. All these factors and probably more matter. But I think, one message I think is, regardless of how we got into the mess, the issue is how we get out of it. So even with the best analysis of the world of how we got here, we have to think about how we move forward. And one aspect of this, I think, which is important, is looking at research and development. So if you look at research and development as a fraction of our GDP from 1981 onwards, you can see that the UK, although at least arrested some of the decline, is now below where most of our comparator countries are. So certainly compared to the kind of East Asian countries like China and South Korea, whose R&D has increased a lot relative to the income, but also well below now Japan, Germany, the US, and France. So there is a straight challenge of insufficient resources going into kind of research and development. So my last 5 minutes or so, let me move on to how we can, or some ideas about how we can get out of the problem that we're in. So given time, I'm not going to be able to go into all the details of what the plan is. I think there's a kind of a short run and a long run element to it. An important principle is that we need to link these short and long run things together, and our policies need to be evidence-based. If you're interested in more of the details, the types of the kind of growth plan we could do, I would point you to the excellent LSE Growth Commission, the first and the second growth commissions we've done, and the series that the CEP is doing on how to get out of the COVID pandemic. In particular, this is work by Ralph Martin and Anna Valero, looking at how we should think of a sustainable recovery, thinking of green innovation. This is a paper I've written with a more US focus, with some proposals for the Biden administration, some of which are being taken up. So what are the principles? So, I think the first principle, obviously there is a public finance issue. We are spending a lot of money to help protect the economy during the COVID pandemic, and there's lots of calls for moving now towards fixing the public finances. I think moving too quickly to cutting spending or increasing taxes would be a really serious mistake. We still have an era of low interest rates. Moving towards premature austerity was, I think, a mistake of what we learned from the global financial crisis. So although we need a plan in order to think about the public finances, we don't need to do this in an accelerated and a quick way, like I think we mistakenly did at the start of the global financial crisis. We have to think about the balance between protection and reallocation. So at the moment, a lot of the emphasis rightly has been going into protecting jobs and protecting businesses. But as we move into the post-COVID era, hopefully with help of the vaccines, we need to think about this reallocation. We need to think about how we move resources and jobs and activity towards some of the growth areas of the economy. So if we think about this, there are many of the support packages which we have in place, both on the kind of job retention scheme, the business support policies, bounce back loan scheme, business interruption schemes, are going to have a cliff edge in the spring. So we need to smooth this cliff edge. We need to reduce the support on this as the economy improves, not to do it too quickly, in order to avoid going into a more serious recession and to reduce the loss of viable skills in firms. And we need to own up to the fact that many of these loans are not all going to be paid back. So I welcome the Chancellor's elongating the time period for paying back some of the bounce back loan schemes. But I think actually we're going to need some more serious debt restructuring, which could be a mixture of the government taking debt equity swaps and actually writing off some of these loans. And I think we also need to combine this with support for startups. So, we have to really think about how we get this eradication activity into kind of growth activities and new startup activities, and not focus just on kind of incumbent firms. How about in the longer run? Well, there's several things that we need here. One important lesson from the Growth Commission is that we need a set of new institutions to mitigate what I sometimes call policy attention deficit disorder, which has been one of the main problems with long run I think investments in the UK. One of the UK's big problems is that we've been very bad at making long run investments in innovation and human capital and in investment. So things like a national infrastructure bank are actually going to be very important in order to try and provide complementary finance to help us out of the hole that we're in. Having some of these institutions which have some independence enables them to at least have some protection about the kind of day-to-day political pressures that are faced. So it's very important that these set of new institutions that we have support growth and have some degree of independence. We need to have structural policies. There are serious challenges in our competition policy. We have growth of these kind of superstar, extremely large firms, especially in the kind of digital sphere. We need to think about new types of ways of dealing with reinvigorating competition to prevent a loss of enforcement of antitrust. And we have to, too much of competition policy is backward looking, whereas I think in the modern economy we have to think of a forward looking type of competition policy. So a merger today with a small firm which looks harmless may be harmful if that firm could have been a future competitor. Think about the Facebook WhatsApp merger, for example. I think Brexit is going to be a major hangover for the economy, and I think the best way, of course, the best way would be to reverse Brexit. But in the absence of that, we should rejoin the single market as countries outside the European Union, like Norway, have. This would avoid having the serious trade barriers that have been erected and are going to be erected in the future against our nearest neighbor. So that's one important thing. And we also think of a variety of tax reforms. So, we should be taxing bads like carbon. We should be aiming towards greater transparency, greater neutrality. We should be taxing more heavily inefficient things which don't move like land in order to get the kind of funds that we need. For human capital, the big challenge in the UK is intermediate skills. So, Britain's been relatively strong, as I mentioned, on higher education and elite education. It's much weaker on people who don't go to university. So the real challenge is to build up intermediate skills through apprenticeships. You see people put forward a proposal for a human capital credit, like the R&D tax credit, which I think is a good idea. We need to think of a modern industrial policy. One of our strengths is around our universities, like we are now. So we should think about a modern industrial policy to build on our comparative advantage around universities. In terms of innovation policies, I mentioned we should think about around what works. In some of my work, I have this what I call a light bulb table, which goes through the portfolio of policies and tries to score them in terms of the quality of the evidence and the kind of cost benefits and the impact of inequality. So I think we need a mixture of different policies, a mixture of direct subsidies, of tax policies. One thing that I think is important when we think about innovation policies is binding them together around missions. So the climate change mission is an important mission, and we can think about having our set of innovation policies as trying to deal with that problem. So use the best evidence of what works, but combine that with what we know is important about trying to get green innovation. And I'll end with one type of thing about innovation policy. So, there's one sort of policies around direct subsidies for R&D and about tax credits. There's another set of policies around supply side policies about increasing the number of potential inventors. And, we can do that. Universities is one, immigration and skilled immigration is another. But one of the things that I really think I'm very passionate about is what I sometimes call the lost Einstein effect. And this is, goes back to some work that I did with Raz Chetty and Zara Yaravel, who's also a professor at LSE. And it comes from this following picture. What we did, this is from US data. What we did is we got the 1.2 million inventors in the US since 1996. So this is everybody who's ever taken a patent out in the US. And then we matched that to the de-identified tax records. So we could see, whether, features of whether you grew up to be an inventor or not as a function of how wealthy your parents were. And what this graph shows you is that for kids who were born to the richest 1% of parents, they were 10 times more likely to grow up to be an inventor than for kids who were born in the bottom 50%. And we could also, because we had data on the kind of math scores and the test scores of these kids, we could also see whether this strong relationship between your kind of parents' income and your chance of becoming an inventor was due to, well, whether these kids were smarter. That hardly explains anything. It really isn't to do with the underlying ability of these kids. It's that these kids just weren't given what you might think is a proper chance in life to become inventors. And we sometimes call this the lost Einstein or lost Marie Curie effect. And the idea is that a major impediment to innovation is the supply of talented inventors is held back either by class, the wealth of their parents, the race, or their gender. and policies which are kind to improving schools and low-income neighborhoods, which improve the role models, which improve networks and mentors, which reduce discrimination, can unlock this hidden talent. We estimate in our paper that it could quadruple the innovation rate, and it's an example of a set of policies which both could be good for equity by giving people chances in life, and could be very good for long-run growth. This is a very long-run policy, but it's the kind of policy which both helps growth and also helps equity as well. So, I'll wrap it up there. I mean, I think that, I hope I've shown you that we in Britain and around the world face a severe productivity growth problem. It's particularly bad in the UK, and since this has obviously hit us since COVID, but has been there since the global financial crisis. Are these ideas I have politically feasible? Well, events like COVID and Brexit, I think, are not welcome, but events which cause major damage can shock society into making radical changes. So I think about the example of World War II. No one would have wanted World War II, but out of the ashes of World War II, a new type of state was born, the kind of welfare state, an idea that we could actually move towards a better way of living. We built new institutions around the world to do that through openness, through better trade. And, I think at this point we have, a lot of cross-party consensus on the need for investment in innovation, the importance of the role of the state in rebuilding the economy. And, my view is that we can use this as an opportunity to learn from social sciences over what policies work and do not work, and help to go forward, form this kind of plan to create sustainable and equitable growth over the next few years and decades. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Manoush.
Thank you so much, John. We are almost out of time, and I've got permission to go 5 minutes over. So I'm going to rattle up. We've got some fantastic questions in the chat. I'm going to try and summarize a couple of them. So we've got a set of questions around the service sector and the fact that the UK economy is 80% services. There's nothing for services in the Brexit deal in terms of market access. To what extent is being so service dependent part of the problem with productivity? And as advanced economies have bigger service sectors, is that a big part of the reason why productivity and growth are stagnating?
I mean, it's true that measured productivity goes faster in manufacturing than it does in the service sector. But, I think that, the measures I've shown you covered all sectors of the economy, and the slowdown in productivity has happened both in manufacturing and in the service sector. So I don't think that I don't think that being in the service sector itself is a disadvantage. In fact, I think you could see that many of the kind of high skills, knowledge intensive services like universities, like financial services, like consultancy are actually part of the kind of growth sectors of the future. So I actually don't think that's the main problem. And certainly there's a measurement issue, but unless measurement got suddenly worse in 2008, which I don't think it did, I don't think that's the main problem we faced.
Okay. The inevitable question on robots and automation and what that's going to do to labor markets and productivity. What's your view?
Well, there's always been, if you go back in history, there's always these fears of, robots destroying jobs or some form of automation destroying all jobs, back all the way back to the times of the Luddites. And, the story of what's happened, we've had this amazing technological progress. The unemployment rate hasn't kept on going up. In fact, if anything, it's been pretty stable. So I don't think that the main risk of robots and automation is over jobs. I think the main risk is over the quality of jobs. And the important thing that we have to realize is that many of these new technologies can actually reduce the quality of jobs. And we have to find a way of setting the institutions and policies right, that the benefits that we get, the high productivity we get from automation, can feed through into better quality of jobs. And I think we can do that both by helping direct technology, but also by having things which actually give people the skills to use those technologies better. So I actually, I think it's a valid concern, but I think there's much bigger things to worry about than the robots.
Okay, I think I can squeeze in 2 more questions because your answers are concise. Competition policy, key obviously for innovation and growth. How do you see competition policy having to change to enable greater innovation and growth going forward?
So I think the key thing is this: to have a forward-looking competition policy. So I think we have to have a tougher competition policy. We have to realize that many firms, although they they may create lots of good innovations, once they get to be very dominant, like the Microsofts, like the Apples, like the Facebooks, like the Googles, can do things to undermine competition, particularly, for example, by taking over promising startup firms, which could become threats to them in the future. So I think when we think about a merger, or when we think about the right regulations, we have to be forward looking. We can't just say this firm is small now, because it may have become a threat to that dominant firm in the future. So that's, I think, what we have to do fundamentally.
And would you also, the current competition policy says you have to prove consumer detriment now. When you say forward looking, do you also mean risks of consumer detriment in the future?
Well, we're meant to look at risk of consumer detriment in the future, even now. So, we're meant to be saying, but the problem is the burden of proof is often too heavy on the government side, because you have to really say, oh, well, this small firm may become a competitor in the future, but we can't be sure. And the other side will say, well, it's only got a 5% or 2% market share now, so how can you possibly prove it's a threat? But I think you need to kind of shift the burden of proof. You have to say to the kind of Googles or the Facebooks, well, give me some assurance that if you take over an Instagram, you're not going to absorb it into your ecosystem, and then mean that it won't become a platform threat to you in the future, or it never was a platform threat. And I think that shift to the burden of proof is something that we have to deal with, actually, because otherwise the companies can always get away with a very anti-competitive acquisition policy.
Okay, then I've got a question on taxation. How important do you think changes in taxation were in explaining the UK's relatively good growth performance in between 1979 and 2008? And what tax changes would you recommend to boost productivity in the next decade?
So, I think some of the improvements were simplification of the tax system. I think the level of taxes is not so important. So people, obviously, if you have 100% taxation of 99, that's not a good thing. But for the general levels of taxation we see, it's not so much the level which is the problem. It's when the tax system is very complex, very untransparent, has lots of distortions. So simplification of the tax system, transparency of the tax system, some of those things I think were useful in terms of how we change things. So in terms of going forward, I think those are still good principles to have. I would like to see, we have a R&D tax credit system. I'd make that a bit more generous. I would have a human capital tax credit system in order to give people incentives to get better training, especially these intermediate skills. I would also shift more of taxation to immobile factors like land rather than mobile factors. So it's a sales-based thing for multinationals where they're selling the stuff rather than the profits. And, so I think we could, a more property-based system would actually be quite a good thing for redistribution as well. There's lots of other kinds of things in the tax system I could talk about, but I think you should think about taxing bads would be a way to think about it. So carbon tax bad. Don't tax goods. Try and keep it as these. The Merley's review is fantastic on this, actually. If you're reading one thing, I'd take a look at that.
Do you have any views on the relative taxation of capital versus labor? Because the tax system has now shifted heavily to taxing labor and not taxing capital. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there is a bit of a pro. Yeah, I'd shift things a little bit back towards taxing capital, but I think it's the way we tax capital which is probably more important, the balance between capital and labor. So I would, like we're just discussing with multinationals, because we try and tax them on the profits, they can play transfer pricing games where they take the profits. If you actually tax them based on where they're selling the products, that's much, it's much harder to play games with that. So having that as the tax base, like the OECD recommends, would be a way of actually protecting the tax base in a more efficient way. Having subsidies for things which are growth creation, like innovation or research, I think are good things. having heavier tax on more immobile factors like land, and having a proper property base. Reevaluating the true cost of land would be a good start for this. We haven't reevaluated that since 1992, I think. So that would be a very good place to start. But more broadly thinking about taxing land rather than taxing things which are kind of job and productivity creation would be the kind of principles I'd use.
Okay, well, thank you, John. That was fantastic. Quite a tour de force. You covered so much ground. And
probably too much.
Well, you still managed to answer about 10 questions in 10 minutes. So, so thank you so much for really challenging us to think differently about growth going forward, and how we could have a different kind of growth, a better kind of growth, but growth nevertheless as a key way to improve human welfare over the years ahead. Thank you also to the audience for some wonderful questions. I'm sorry to have summarized some of them a bit, but I think we covered most of them, and they were all excellent. And please join in future events as we continue to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Center for Economic Performance. And I think this evening's presentation from Professor John van Reenen shows you why CEP is such an important fixture in the firmament for generating creative, innovative, and highly relevant research to address the biggest problems of our
Send me
time.
questions by email as well if you want. So I'm very happy to receive questions by email, and I'll seek to answer them.
Very good. Thank you so much, John. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Take care.
Bye.